The desert had never been kind, but that summer it felt like the earth itself wanted to burn away everything that walked upon it. Luke Turner wiped the sweat from his brow, his hat tilted low against the sun, driving cattle across cracked ground that groaned beneath each hoof. At only 22, his body was strong, but his spirit carried the weary air of a man much older. Every mile of dust carved lines into his face. Every dry gust whispered a single truth. The frontier would either forge him into steel or grind him down into nothing. By afternoon, the heat had twisted into something worse. The sky darkened, not with clouds of shade, but with the ominous swell of a storm barreling across the mesas. Lightning split the horizon, jagged and merciless. Luke knew cattle would scatter if he didn't find shelter fast. He drove the herd toward a ridge, his horse pounding against the earth until he spotted it, a hut, old and forgotten, tucked against the canyon wall. Relief washed through him. Shelter meant survival, even if it was only for the night. The door creaked when he pushed inside, the sound sharp against the growl of thunder. Dust floated in thin shafts of light, and the air smelled of earth and smoke long extinguished. Luke stepped in, boots scraping wood, heart still racing from the storm. But before he could claim the space as his eyes adjusted and froze. In the far corner sat a figure, a girl barely older than him, though the fire in her gaze carried centuries. Her wrists were wrapped in leather, symbols of a ceremony older than his bloodline. She was an Apache bride, dressed not in silks, but in strength. Her long dark hair clung to her shoulders, her skin bronze against the pale light seeping in through the cracks. Her posture was still, yet defiant, as though daring him to speak first. Luke's breath caught. The world outside roared with chaos, but in that moment silence weighed heavier than thunder. Two strangers, bound not by choice but by fate, found themselves trapped inside four walls that suddenly felt too small. Luke tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. The girl's eyes, deep and unyielding, seemed to measure his soul. He had heard stories of Apache women, how they were fierce, untamed, loyal beyond measure, but none of those tales prepared him for her. She was not broken, though circumstance had placed her here. She was not meek, though her hands trembled faintly. She was alive with a strength Luke could barely comprehend, and it unsettled him more than the storm outside. His instincts, born from years of surviving alone, screamed at him to leave her be. Yet another part of him, the part that still carried boyhood, longed to reach out, to ask her name, to assure her she was safe. But was she, was he? The walls seemed to press closer as lightning lit her face in flashes. She did not flinch. She did not bow. Her silence was not submission, it was defiance. And Luke realized that this storm inside the hut might be fiercer than the one outside. Minutes stretched into hours, the storm howling through cracks in the wood. Luke laid his saddle against the wall, sitting across the room, his rifle resting by his side. The girl never moved her gaze from him, as if daring him to betray the uneasy truce between them. He wanted to ask why she was here, what fate had led her into this lonely canyon, but something held him back. Respect, perhaps, or fear. Because, though she looked fragile, Luke felt she carried the weight of something far greater than herself. As night fell, the hut darkened except for the occasional burst of lightning. Luke built a small fire in the stone pit, the flames dancing between them. She shifted slightly, her eyes catching the glow, revealing both her exhaustion and her pride. For a moment, the crackle of fire softened the tension, though neither spoke. Luke's chest ached with the pressure of words unspoken. He wanted to tell her he meant no harm, that he wasn't like the traders or outlaws who treated people like possessions. But words seemed too fragile for the weight of this silence. The storm raged, but within the hut another kind of storm brewed. Luke wrestled with himself, between the boy he had been and the man he was becoming. For years, solitude had been his only companion. He knew cattle better than people, knew silence better than laughter. Yet here was someone who shattered that silence without saying a word. Every glance from her eyes chipped away at his boyhood, demanding something stronger, braver, nobler. He felt himself changing, though he couldn't yet name what into. At last, she shifted closer to the fire, her hands resting in her lap. In a voice soft but steady, she spoke a single word. He couldn't understand it, but the sound struck him deeper than any language he knew. Luke's heart pounded as he nodded, whispering back his own name, Luke. It felt like the first crack in a wall, the first bridge across a chasm. Her lips curved, not into a smile but into something gentler, almost an acknowledgement. And for the first time, the hut did not feel like a prison. The night stretched on, filled with storms, both inside and out. Luke did not sleep. He watched her by the firelight, memorizing the strength etched into her posture, the quiet defiance in her gaze. He wondered what her life had been before this, what dreams she had carried, what battles she had fought. In the depths of that silence, he knew one truth. This encounter was no accident. Fate had drawn them together, and whether for a night or a lifetime, it would change him forever. The boy was fading. The man was awakening. Night pressed heavier with each passing hour, the storm outside clawing at the hut as though it wanted to tear its walls apart. But inside, the firelight softened the edges of fear. Luke sat with his back against the wall, boots stretched before him, eyes fixed on the girl across the flames. Her breathing had slowed, no longer frantic with mistrust but measured, steady, as though the storm had finally exhausted her spirit. For the first time, he wondered not just who she was, but who he was becoming in her presence. At last, she spoke again, her voice carrying in the hush between thunderclaps. "Ahyoka," she said, pressing her hand to her chest. Her name. Luke repeated it clumsily, his accent heavy, but her eyes softened at his attempt. The syllables lingered in the air like a secret, binding them in ways neither yet understood. In the fragile quiet of that hut, a name became more than introduction. It became an offering, a step across the vast divide of culture and fate. Luke leaned forward, his voice low. "Luke," he said again, though she had already heard it. He wanted her to know, to remember, to carry it as he carried hers. The storm rattled the roof, yet somehow their small exchange silenced the chaos outside. It wasn't much. Just two names spoken into firelight. But Luke felt the weight of it, the truth that manhood wasn't measured in cattle or coin, but in moments like these, when respect grew out of silence, and dignity was offered instead of taken, the hours crawled. Ahyoka shifted closer to the flames, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She didn't speak more, yet Luke could feel her presence filling the hut like something sacred. He watched her carefully, not with hunger but with reverence. Every movement, every glance, carved into his restless heart like scripture. He realized then that he wasn't trapped by the storm or the walls around him. He was trapped by something far stronger, an awakening within himself that had no words, only weight. The boy in him wrestled with the man he was becoming. The boy wanted to look away, to retreat into silence, to let the storm pass and forget. But the man couldn't. The man wanted to honor the courage it took for her to speak her name, to sit across from him, unbroken, after all she had endured. The fire crackled between them, the smoke curling upward like prayers neither could speak. Outside, lightning tore the sky, but inside, something fragile and eternal was being forged. As dawn crept closer, the storm began to tire. The thunder softened, the rain thinned, and silence returned to the canyon. Luke, weary but restless, found his gaze fixed on Ahyoka still. She hadn't slept. Her eyes remained steady, watching him as though she too saw the shift in him. For a moment, Luke wondered if she had seen it before in others. That moment when innocence gave way to responsibility, when boyhood crumbled beneath the weight of manhood. He didn't need to ask. He knew she understood. The first light of day seeped through the cracks, painting her face in pale gold. In that light, she seemed less like a stranger and more like destiny itself, unyielding, mysterious, yet profoundly human. Luke swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. He wanted to say more than his name, more than silence. He wanted to promise her safety, to prove she wasn't alone in this unforgiving world. But promises were fragile things, easily broken. And Luke knew manhood wasn't about making vows, it was about keeping them. She rose slowly, her movements graceful despite the stiffness of the night. Standing by the firelight, Ahyoka seemed taller, her shoulders squared as though reclaiming strength stolen from her. Luke stood too, uncertain, his hat twisting nervously in his hands. Their eyes met across the flickering glow, and the air between them grew heavy again, but not with fear. With choice. With possibility. Ahyoka nodded once, a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes. It was not surrender. It was acknowledgement of his respect, of his restraint, of his humanity. Luke understood in that instant that manhood wasn't proven by fists, or by the cattle he drove, or by the rifle he carried. It wasn't proven by surviving storms or enduring solitude. It was proven here, in the presence of another soul, by honoring her dignity and giving her freedom. His chest tightened with the weight of that truth. He had entered the hut as a boy running from weather, but he would leave it as a man who had faced something far greater, himself. When the storm finally broke, the sun stretched its fingers across the desert, pulling shadows away from the land. The hut creaked as if exhaling relief. Luke opened the door, stepping out into the crisp air, the earth damp and alive again. Behind him, Ahyoka followed, her steps sure, her head held high. They stood together at the threshold, two strangers bound not by possession, but by respect born in firelight. Luke felt the world shift, subtle yet undeniable. The boy who entered this place had not survived the night. Only a man remained.